Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of History of Chivalry and the Crusades by G.P.R. James. Chapter 11.
Before proceeding to trace the events which occurred in the Holy Land between the Second and Third Crusades, it may be as well to keep our eyes upon Europe for a few moments, and to remark the advance of society toward civilization. Prior to the period of the first expedition to Palestine, Germany had been occupied alone in struggling against the papal authority, and in fighting for dominions in Italy, the limits of which were always sufficiently vague to admit of disputes and aggressions on all parts. Apulia and the southern portion of Italy had been subjected, as we have seen, by the Normans, and the rest of that country, with the exception of some small republican cities, was divided into feudal baronies, the right of homage over which was very uncertain. Engaged in private wars and feuds where personal interest was the sole object, unmixed with any refining principle, the chivalry of Italy made but small progress. From time to time, a great and distinguished chief started up and dignified his country, but the general feeling of knightly zeal was not extended far in Italy, or was wasted in the petty purposes of confined and unimportant struggles. In Germany, also, chivalry advanced but little. There was much dignified firmness in the character of the people, and under the walls of Damascus in the wars with the Pope and with the Norman possessors of Calabria, the German knights evinced that in the battlefield none were more daring, more powerful, or more resolute. But we find few instances where enthusiasm was mingled with valor, and where the ardor of chivalric devotion was joined to the bold courage of the Teutonic warrior. In Spain, the spirit was at its height, but Spain had her own crusades, and it was quite enough for the swords of her gallant band of knights to free their native land, inch by inch, from her Saracen invaders. Military orders were there instituted in the middle of the 12th century, and the Knights of Calatrava and St. James might challenge the world to produce a more chivalrous race than themselves. Still, the object of all their endeavors was the freedom of their native country from the yoke of the Moors, and they engaged but little in any of those great expeditions which occupied the attention and interest of the world. It is to France, then, and to England, under the dominion of its Norman monarchs, that we must turn our eyes, and here, during the course of the 12th century, we shall find great and extraordinary progress. Previous to the epoch of the Crusades, France, though acknowledging one king, had consisted of various nations, whose manners, habits, and languages differed in the most essential points. The Provençal was as opposite a being to the Frank of that day as the Italian is now to the Russian. The Norman and the Breton also descended from distinct origins, and in most cases these separate tribes hated each other with no slight share of enmity. The character of the Norman was in all times enterprising, wandering, cunning, and selfish. That of the Breton or Armorican, savage, ferocious, daring, and implacable, but imaginative in the highest degree as well as superstitious. The Provençal was light, avaricious, keen, active, and sensual. The Frank, bold, hardy, persevering, but vain, insolent, and thoughtless. Distinctive character lies more generally in men's faults than their virtues, and thus all these different races possessed the same higher qualities in common. They were brave to a prodigy, energetic, talented, enthusiastic, but during the 11th and the beginning of the 12th centuries, the rude state of society in which chivalry had arisen continued to affect it still. The First Crusade, however, gave an impulse to all those countries that joined in it, which tended infinitely to civilize Europe by uniting nations and tribes, which had long been separated by different interests, in one great enterprise, wherein community of object and community of danger necessarily harmonized many previously discordant feelings, and did away many old animosities by the strong power of mutual assistance and mutual endeavor. The babel of languages which Fulcher describes in the Christian camp before long began to form itself into two more general tongues. Latin, notwithstanding all the support it received in the court, in the church, and in the schools, was soon confined to the cloister. And the langue d'oc, or Provençal, became the common language of all the provinces on the southern side of the Loire, while the langue d'oil only was spoken in the north of France. The manners and habits of the people, too, were gradually shaded into each other. The distinctions became less defined. The Provençal no longer looked upon the Breton as a savage, and the Frank no longer classed the Provençal with the ape. 1,000 alliances were formed between individuals of different tribes, and the hand of kindred smoothed away the remaining asperities of national prejudice. Such assimilations tend, of course, to calm and mollify the mind of man, so that the general character of the country became of a less rude and ferocious nature. At this time, too, sprang up that greatest of all the softeners of the human heart, poetry. And immense was the change it wrought in the manners and deportment of that class which constituted the society of the 12th century. The poetry of that age bore as distinct and clear a stamp of the epoch to which it belonged as any that the world ever produced, and it is absurd to trace to an earlier day the origin of a kind of poesy which was founded upon chivalry alone, and reflected nothing but the objects of a chivalrous society. It is little important which of the two tongues of France first boasted a national poet, and equally unimportant which gave birth to the most excellent poetry. The Languedoc was the most mellifluous. The Languedoil was the most forcible, but neither brought forth anything but the tales, the songs, the satires, the ballads of chivalry. It is more than probable that some musical ear in Provence first applied to his own language the melody of regularly arranged syllables and the jingle of rhyme. No sooner was this done than the passion spread to all classes. Chivalrous love and chivalrous warfare furnished subjects in plenty, and the gai savoir, the beau parleur, became the favorite relaxation of those very men who wielded the lance and sword in the battlefield. The troubadours were multiplied to infinity. The language lent itself almost spontaneously to versification, and kings, warriors, and ladies, as well as the professed poets, occasionally practiced the new and captivating art, which at once increased chivalrous enthusiasm by spreading and perpetuating the fame of noble deeds, and softened the manners of the age by the influence of sweet sounds and intellectual exercises. The songs themselves soon became as various as those who composed them, and were divided into serventes, tensons, pastorelles, and nouvelles, or contes. The conte, or tale in verse, needs no description, and the nature of the pastorelle also is self-evident. The servente deserves more particular notice. It was in fact a satire of the most biting and lively character, in which wit and poetry were not used to cover or to temper the reprobation of either individual or general vice, but rather, on the contrary, to give point and energy to invective. The keen bitterness of the troubadours spared neither rank nor caste. Kings and nobles and priests all equally underwent the lash of their wit, and it is from these very servants that we gain a clear insight into many of the customs and manners of that day, as well as into many, too many, scenes of grossness and immorality, from which we would fain believe that chivalry was free. The tensons, or jeux partis, were dialogues between two persons on some subject of love or chivalry, and in general show far more subtlety than poetical feeling. To these were added occasional epistles in verse, and plaints, or lamentations, in which the death or misfortune of a friend was mourned with a touching simplicity that has since been too often imitated with very ineffective art. Other compositions, such as the aubade and the serenade, were in use, the difference of which from the common lay consisted merely in their metrical construction, the word alba being always repeated at the end of each stanza of the aubade, and the word ser continually terminating each division of the serenade. Such was the poesy of the Languedoc and the troubadours. The Languedoil had also its poets, the trouvères, and its poesy, which differed totally from that of the Languedoc. The art was here more ambitious than with the Provençals, and we find, among the first productions of the trouvères, long and complex poems, which would fain deserve the name of epics. The first of these, both in date and importance, is the Norman romance of Rou, which bears a considerable resemblance, in its object and manner, to the fragments of old Scandinavian poetry which have come down to us, but has a continuous and uniform subject and strong attempts at unity of design. The Romance of the Rose also, commenced by Guillaume de Loris and concluded by Jean de Meung, is one of the most extraordinary compositions that the world ever produced, and stands perfectly alone, an allegory in 22,000 verses. Various subjects, quite irrelevant to the object of the song, are introduced in its course, and the poet mingles his tale with satire and sarcasm, which were fully as often misdirected as deserved. Besides, these were all the famous romances of chivalry, which probably originated in the fabulous but interesting story of Charlemagne's visit to the Holy Land, falsely attributed to the Archbishop Turpin. This work bears internal evidence of having been written after the First Crusade, and we have reason to suppose was translated into French from the Latin manuscript of some monkish author. In all the romances of the Round Table, we trace the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century. They could not have been composed prior to that epoch, for we find many customs and objects mentioned which were not known at an earlier period, and it is probable, from various circumstances, that they are not referable to a later age. Besides these, multitudes of fabliaux have descended to us from the Trouvé, and in this sort of composition, it is but fair to say, we find more originality, variety, and strength, though less sweetness and less enthusiasm, than among the compositions of the troubadours. At this period also we meet with an institution in Provence, of which I shall speak but slightly, from many motives, though undoubtedly it had a great influence upon the character of chivalry. I mean the court of love, as it was called, where causes concerning that passion were tried and judged as seriously as if feelings could be submitted to a tribunal. Could that be the case? The object of such a court should certainly be very different from that of the Provençal court of love, the effect of which was anything but to promote morality. It tended, however, with everything else, to soften the manners of the country, though all the mad absurdities to which it gave rise were a scandal and a disgrace to Europe. Besides all these causes of mitigation, the constant journeys of the people of Europe to the Holy Land taught them gradually the customs of other nations, and in that age there was much good to be learned by a frequent intercourse with foreigners. The great want of Europe was civilization. The vices of the day were pretty equally spread through all countries, and the very circumstance of mingling with men of different habits and thoughts promoted the end to be desired, without bringing any great importation of foreign follies or crimes. Many useful arts and many sciences previously unknown were also obtained from the Saracens themselves, and though in the Crusades Europe sacrificed a host of her noblest knights and spent immense treasures and energies, yet she derived, notwithstanding, no small benefit from her communication with Palestine. The state of that country, in the meanwhile, was every day becoming more and more precarious. The nations by whom it was surrounded were improving in military discipline, in political knowledge, and in the science of timing and combining their efforts, while the Christians were losing ground in everything but courage. The military orders of the Temple and St. John were the bulwarks of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, but at the same time, by their pride, their disputes, and their ambition, they did nearly as much to undermine its strength at home as they did to support it with their swords in the field of battle. It would be endless to trace all the events in Palestine which brought about the Third Crusade, and to investigate minutely the causes which worked out the ruin of the Christian dominion in the Holy Land. The simple facts must be enough in this place. Although the crusade which went forth for the express purpose of delivering Edessa never even attempted that object, Jocelyn of Courtenay did not neglect to struggle for his lost territory, and gained some splendid successes over the infidels, which were all in turn reversed by his capture and death in prison. After his failure, the difficulty of keeping Edessa was so apparent that the monarch of Jerusalem determined to yield it to the Emperor Manuel Comnenus, on condition of his defending it against the Turks. Manuel, therefore, received the principality, but the weak and cowardly Greeks soon lost what the valiant Franks could not maintain, and before a year was over, Nourhaddin the Great, Sultan of Aleppo, was in full possession of Edessa and all its dependencies. Baldwin III, however, who had cast off the follies of his youth, and now displayed as great qualities as any of his race, more than compensated for the loss of that principality by the capture of Ascalon. After this great success, 8 years of varied warfare followed, and at the end of that period, Baldwin died, leaving behind him the character of one of the noblest of the Latin kings. His brother Almeric ascended the vacant throne, but with talents infinitely inferior, and a mind in no degree calculated to cope with the great and grasping genius of Nurhaden, who combined in rare union the qualities of an ambitious and politic monarch with the character of a liberal, frugal, and unostentatious man. Almeric was ambitious also, but his avarice was always a check on his ambition, and he suffered himself often to be bribed where he might have conquered. At this time, the Fatimite caliphs of Egypt had fallen into a state of nonentity. The country was governed by a vizier, and the high office was struggled for by a succession of military adventurers. Such a state of things awakened the attention of the monarchs of Jerusalem and Aleppo, and each resolved to make himself master of Egypt. An opportunity soon presented itself. Shor, the vizier of Egypt, was expelled from his post by Dargham, a soldier of fortune. The disgraced vizier fled to the court of Nurhaden and prayed for assistance against the usurper. Nurhaden willingly granted a request, which yielded the means of sending his troops into Egypt. And two Kurdish refugees, uncle and nephew, who had risen high in his army under the names of Asad eddin Shirkuh and Salah eddin or Saladin, were dispatched with considerable forces to expel Dargham and to re-establish Shawar. Dargham saw the gathering storm, and to shelter himself from its fury called the Christians from Palestine to his aid. But the movements of the Moslems were more rapid than those of Almeric, and before the king of Jerusalem could reach Cairo, Shirkuh had given battle to Dargham, and defeated and killed him, and Shawar was repossessed of the authority he had lost. Shawar soon found that his power was fully as much in danger from his allies as it had been from his enemies, and to resist the Turks whom he had brought into Egypt, he was obliged to enter into a treaty with the Christians. Almeric marched immediately to Cairo, and after a multitude of maneuvers and skirmishes, forced Shirkuh and Saladin to quit the country, displaying through the whole of this war more scientific generalship than was at all usual in that age. No sooner were the Turks gone than the Latin monarch broke his truce with the Egyptians, and Shawar was once more obliged to apply to Nurhaden. Shirkuh again advanced into the Fatimite dominions with increased forces, obliged Almeric to retreat with great loss, took possession of Cairo, beheaded Shawar, and installed himself in the office of vizier to Adhad, Caliph of Egypt, though he still retained the title of lieutenant for Nurhaden of Aleppo. Not long after these successes, Shirkuh died, and Nurhaden, doubtful of the fidelity of the Turkish emirs, gave the vacant post to Saladin, the nephew of the late vizier, in which choice he was as much guided by the apparently reckless and pleasure-seeking despotism of the young Kurdish chief as by the military skill he had shown when forced unwillingly into action. Saladin, however, was scarcely invested with supreme power in Egypt when his real character appeared. He cast from him the follies with which he had veiled his great and daring mind, and by means of the immense treasures placed at his command, soon bound to his interests many who had been at first disgusted by his unexpected elevation. The caliphs of Egypt had been always considered as schismatics by the caliphs of Baghdad, to whom Nurhaden still affected homage, and Saladin was forthwith instructed to declare the Fatimite dynasty at an end, and to re-establish in Egypt the nominal dominion of the Abbasides. This was easily accomplished. Adhad, the caliph, either died before the revolution was completed or was strangled in the bath. The people little cared under whose yoke they labored. The children of the late caliph were confined in the harem, and Mochadi, caliph of Baghdad, was prayed for as God's vicar on earth. Saladin's ambitious projects became every day more and more apparent, and Nurhaden was not blind to the conduct of his officer. Submission quieted his suspicions for a time, and though repeated causes for fresh jealousy arose, he was obliged to forego marching into Egypt in person, as he undoubtedly intended, till death put a stop to all his schemes. No sooner was Nurhaden dead than Almeric attacked his widow at Panias, and Saladin began to encroach upon other parts of his territories. But Saladin was the only gainer by the death of the great Sultan, and made himself master by various means of the whole of his Syrian dominions, while internal dissensions and changes in the government of Palestine gradually weakened every bulwark of the Latin throne. Almeric died in returning from Panias, and his son, Baldwin IV, surnamed the Leper, succeeded him. Had his corporeal powers been equal to the task of royalty, it is probable that Baldwin would have been a far greater monarch than his father. But, after many struggles for activity, he found that disease incapacitated him for energetic rule, and he entrusted the care of the state to Guy of Lusignan, who had married his sister Sibylla, widow of the Marquis of Montferrat, to whom she had borne one son. Guy of Lusignan soon showed himself unworthy of the charge, and Baldwin, resuming the government, endeavored to establish it in such a form that it might uphold itself after his death, which he felt to be approaching. With this view, he offered the administration to the Count of Tripoli during the minority of his sister's child, but the Count refused to accept it, except under condition that the charge of the young prince should be given to Jocelyn de Courtenay, the surviving branch of the Courtenays of Edessa, and son of the unhappy count who died in a Saracen prison. He also stipulated that the castles and fortresses of the kingdom should be garrisoned by the Hospitallers and Templars, and that in case the boy should die in his youth, the question of succession should be determined by the Pope, the Emperor of Germany, the King of France, and the King of England. Not many years after this, the king died, and Baldwin V succeeded, but his death followed immediately upon his accession. Without abiding by the dispositions of the former monarch, no sooner was the young king dead than the Grand Master of the Temple, Renaud of Châtillon, Count of Carac, and the Patriarch of Jerusalem joined to raise Sibylla to the throne, in spite of the formal protest of all the other barons and the Grand Master of the hospital. The gates of Jerusalem were shut, and it was only by sending one of their followers, disguised as a monk, that the nobles assembled with the Count of Tripoli at Naplusa could gain any tidings of what passed. Sibylla was crowned in form, and then the Patriarch, pointing to the other crown which lay upon the altar, told her that it was hers to dispose of, on which she immediately placed it on the head of Guy of Lusignan. After this, some of the barons refused to do homage to the new king, and some absented themselves from his court. But the imminent danger in which the country was placed at length brought back a degree of concord, when concord could no longer avail. Saladin had by this time made himself master of all Syria, and had not only consolidated into one great monarchy dominions which for ages had been separated into petty states, but also, by the incessant application of a powerful and expansive mind, he had drawn forth and brought into action many latent but valuable resources which had previously been unknown or forgotten. He had taught the whole interests of his people to center in his own person, and he now determined to direct their energies to one great and important enterprise. That enterprise was the conquest of Palestine, and with an army of 50,000 horse and near 200,000 foot, he advanced towards Jerusalem and laid siege to Tiberias. Within the walls of that fortress, the Countess of Tripoli held out against the Saracens, while her husband joined Guy of Lusignan and brought his forces to the field in defense of the Holy Land. The conduct of the Count of Tripoli is very obscure. That from time to time he had treated with the Saracens is evident, and almost every European authority, except Mills, accuses him of having, in this instance, betrayed his countrymen into the hands of the infidels. Whether with or against his advice matters little to the general result. The Christians marched down to meet Saladin at Tiberias. Beyond doubt, it was by the counsel of the Count of Tripoli that they pitched their tents in a spot where no water was to be found. The troops suffered dreadfully from thirst, and in the morning, when they advanced to attack Saladin in the cool of the dawn, the wary monarch retired before them, resolved not to give them battle till the heat of the risen sun had added to their fatigues. To increase the suffocating warmth of a Syrian summer's day, he set fire to the low bushes and shrubs which surrounded the Christian camp, so that when the battle did begin, the Latin forces were quite overcome with weariness and drought. The contest raged throughout the day, the Christians fighting to reach the wells which lay behind the Saracen power, but in vain, and night fell, leaving the strife still doubtful. The next morning, the Latins and Turks again mixed in combat. The Count of Tripoli forced his way through the Saracens and escaped unhurt. But the scimitars of the Moslems mowed down whole ranks of the Christians, for their immense superiority of numbers allowed them to surround the height upon which the king and the chief of his army were stationed, and to wage the warfare at once against every face of the Latin host. Such a conflict could not long endure. Multitudes of the infidels fell, but their loss was nothing in proportion to their number, when compared with that which their adversaries underwent. The Grand Master of the hospital alone clove his way from the field of battle, after having stayed till victory had settled upon the Paynim banners. He reached Ascalon that night, but died on the following day of the wounds he had received. The King Renaud de Châtillon, Count of Carac, who had so often broken faith with the Moslems, and the Grand Master of the Temple, whose whole order was in abhorrence among the Mussulmans, were taken alive and carried prisoners to the tent of Saladin. That monarch remained for some time on the field, giving orders that the Knights of St. John and those of the Temple, who had been captured, should instantly embrace Islamism or undergo the fate of the scimitar. 1,000 acts of cruelty and aggression on their part had given cause to such deadly hatred, but at the hour of death not one knight could be brought to renounce his creed, and they died with that calm resolution which is in itself a glory. After this bloody consummation of his victory, Saladin entered the tent where Lusignan and his companions expected a similar fate. But Saladin, thirsty himself, called for iced sherbet, and having drank, handed the cup to the fallen monarch, a sure pledge that his life was secure. Lusignan in turn passed it to Renaud of Châtillon, but the Sultan, starting up, exclaimed, "No hospitality for the breaker of all engagements." And before Châtillon could drink, with one blow of his scimitar, Saladin severed his head from his body. Tiberius surrendered immediately. City after city now fell into the power of the victor, and at length, after an obstinate defense, Jerusalem once more was trodden by the Moslems. But the conduct of the infidel Sultan on this occasion shames the cruelty of the Crusaders. When the people could hold out no longer, Saladin, who had at first offered the most advantageous terms, insisted that the city should now throw itself upon his mercy. He then agreed upon a moderate ransom for the prisoners, and promised to let each man carry forth his goods without impediment. When this was done, with extraordinary care, he saw that neither insult nor injury should be offered to the Christians, and having taken possession of the town, he placed a guard at one of the gates to receive the ransom of the inhabitants as they passed out. Nevertheless, when the whole wealth which could be collected in the town had been paid down, an immense number of the poorer Christians remained unredeemed. These were destined to be slaves, but Bernard the treasurer relates that Saif Eddin, the brother of the monarch, begged the liberty of 1,000 of these, and that about the same number were delivered at the prayer of the Patriarch and of Balayan de Ibelin, who had commanded in the place and communicated with the Kurdish monarch on its surrender. After this, Saladin declared that his brother, the Patriarch, and Ibelin had done their alms, and that now he would do his alms also, on which he caused it to be proclaimed through the city that all the poor people who could give no ransom might go forth in safety by the gate of St. Lazarus. But he ordered that if any attempted to take advantage of this permission who really could pay for their deliverance, they should be instantly seized and cast into prison. Many of the nobler prisoners also he freed at the entreaty of the Christian ladies, and in his whole conduct he showed himself as moderate in conquest as he was great in battle. Antioch and the neighboring towns, as well as the greater part of the county of Tripoli, were soon reduced to the Saracen yoke, and with the exception of Tyre, which was defended by the gallant Conrad, Marquis of Montferrat, the whole of Palestine became subject to the victor of Tiberius. Such was the sudden and disastrous termination of the Christian dominion in the Holy Land, a misfortune which all the contemporary writers attribute to the vices of the inhabitants. Without presuming to assign it, as they do, to the special wrath of heaven, we may nevertheless believe that the gross and scandalous crimes of the people of Jerusalem greatly accelerated its return to the Moslem domination. After the successes of the First Crusade, the refuse of European populations poured into Palestine in hopes of gain, and brought all their vices to add to the stock of those that the country already possessed. The clergy were as licentious as the laity, the chiefs as immoral as the people. Intestine quarrels are sure to follow upon general crime, and unbridled passions work as much harm to the society in which they are tolerated as to the individuals on whom they are exercised. The Latins of Palestine retained their courage, it is true, but they knew no confidence in each other. Virtue, the great bond of union, subsisted not among them, and each one caballed, intrigued, and strove against his neighbor. The ambition of the two great military orders bred continual hatred and opposition, and the discord that existed between the Hospitallers and the clergy caused another breach in the harmony of the state. During the time that the kingdom of Jerusalem was thus dividing itself by passions and vices into ruinous factions and enfeebled bodies, Saladin and those that preceded him were bending all their energies to consolidate their power and extend their dominion. Zengi was a great warrior, Nurhaddin a great monarch, and Saladin added to the high qualities of both, not only a degree of civilization in his own person, which neither had known, but, what was still more, the spirit of civilization in his heart. Saladin was as superior to any of the princes of Palestine in mind as he was in territory, and with clear and general views of policy, keenness and strength of perception in difficulties, consummate skill in war, innumerable forces, and the hearts of his soldiers, it was impossible that he should not conquer. There can be no doubt that the Latins were a more powerful and vigorous race of men than the Turks. The event of every combat evinced it, and even in their defeats, they almost always left more dead upon the field of the enemy's forces than of their own. Their armor, too, was weightier, and their horses heavier and more overpowering in the charge. But the Turkish horsemen and the Turkish horse were more active and more capable of bearing long fatigue, privation, and heat than the European. And this in some degree made up for the slighter form and lighter arms of the Saracen. In war, also as a science, the Turks had improved more than the Christians. We find that the troops of Saladin employed means in their sieges that they had acquired from the Crusaders, that they stood firmly the charge of the cavalry, that they now fought hand-to-hand with the mailed warriors of Europe, and mixed all the modes of chivalrous warfare with those they had practiced before. We do not perceive, however, that the Latins adopted their activity or their skill with the bow, and at the same time it must be remarked that the armies of the Moslem fought as a whole under the absolute command of one chief, while the Christians, divided in the battle as in the time of peace, were broken into separate corps under feudal leaders, who each consulted his own will fully as much as that of his sovereign. Many other causes might be traced for the Christian fall and the Mussulman triumph, but perhaps more has been already said than was required. Whatever were the causes, the result was the same. Jerusalem was taken by the Moslem, and consternation spread through Christendom.
This concludes today's reading of History of Chivalry and the Crusades by G.P.R. James. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.